Good evening, and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Henrietta Toivonen, and I'm one of the Ath Fellows this year. There is extreme inequality in the way human rights are observed in different regions worldwide. We are very fortunate to live in the West, where we can be fairly certain that our basic human rights are respected. But in many places around the world, this is not the case. Even the most fundamental protections of people are abused by governments or other entities. This kind of inequality breeds instability. As we saw in Paris on Friday, we are not isolated from transnational volatility and terror. It is therefore the concern of the entire international community to collaborate in maintaining security and stability, which also includes active efforts to protect human rights in communities where they are abused. Equality and human rights should be the primary goal pursued jointly by nations around the world. Our speaker tonight, Professor Emilie Hafner-Burton, is the director of the Laboratory on International Law and Regulation and a professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. During her career, she has examined ways to improve protections for human rights and has done research on a wide variety of topics, from economic sanctions to social network analysis. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hafner-Burton to the Athenaeum.
Good evening. I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Am I booming too loud or not loud enough? I can't quite tell. We good? Okay, very good, very good. I just want to begin by thanking first the organizers of this event for thinking about me and inviting me, and also to all of you for coming up to take some time to listen to what I have to say, and what I really hope will be more of a conversation and less of a lecture. So I'm going to invite you to boom in and join into the conversation to the extent that that's possible in this room. So thank you very much. What I want to do is talk with you tonight about something that is really very close to my heart and has really been central to my work as a scholar, but also a teacher for, I guess, the last 15, 20 years. I date myself there, but that's true. And that's the promotion and the protection of human rights. And what I want to do is talk to you about it in a way that might be different from how some of you have heard about it before, which is from the perspective of a social scientist. I'm a political scientist by training, who works with big data, who likes to look for historical patterns in lots of different places over many, many different years, over time, to try and see what we can learn about the human rights system. So that's the perspective that I want to speak to you from tonight. And what I want to do is share 5 facts with you, 5 things that maybe you didn't know before you came here to listen tonight, and then we'll have a conversation. If I can start, though, first, I'd like to come from a place of really personal, which is I just want to express my absolute horror at the attacks and the atrocities that occurred this weekend. It's personal not only because we're going to have a discussion about human rights tonight, it's also personal because I'm French and I was born there, and the terrorists attacked within half of a kilometer of my home, my sister's house and my grandma Lolo. My thoughts are with the victims and their families, also with the first responders who have helped in this crisis. And I think it's fitting to say that these horrific events really underscore the incredible fragility of humankind in some of the conversations that we'll have tonight, and also really the necessity for reasoned, rational, open, safe, well-meaning conversations about really difficult things, our national problems and our world problems. So permit me to just put that on the table as I'm thinking about this. Okay, so let's jump in. Before I jump in with what I'm thinking about these days, I'd like to hear a little bit from you about what comes to mind when somebody says to you human rights. What are the types of things that you might think about when someone says human rights? Violations that you might be thinking about, rights that you might want to advocate for. And I'm going to call on my head table. And I'm not shy, by the way. I do wander, so I'll try not to, I'll try to yell. But my students, who so nicely invited me to sit and talk, what do you think about when you think about human rights? What are some of the rights violations that you're worrying about, that bother you, that talking about and thinking about? Genocide. Okay, yes, genocide. What else? Freedom of assembly. Okay, and what else? Louder. Oh, you can more say it. Freedom of speech. Yes, freedom to speak loud, freedom to have speech. Yes. Good. What else? Anything else?
Deportation.
Deportation. Yes. What else?
Human trafficking.
Human trafficking. Yes. What else?
Housing.
Whoa, say again?
Housing.
Housing. Yes. What about housing?
Housing is a
Like freedom to have it, right? Okay. What else?
healthcare.
Privacy, healthcare. Okay. So many different types of human rights. So decades ago, the United Nations proclaimed to us something that was really totally radical at the time. And that is that all human beings are born free and equal in our dignity and in our rights. And that is regardless of who we are. That is regardless of where we live. That is regardless of what religion or cultural traditions we practice. Regardless of who we love, regardless. Okay? So these are fundamentally conceived as prerequisites to our well-being. And they are universal. And by universal, what the United Nations tells us, and the philosophy of this tells us, and we can talk about it because the philosophy is much more controversial in some sense than the law, which is that they belong to everybody. It doesn't matter where we live, what language we speak, who we love, what religion we do or do not practice. So we generally categorize these rights in two different ways. We talk a lot about civil and political rights, and you've mentioned some of those tonight. That's things like the freedom to vote, the freedom to have representation, the freedom to be free from torture and cruel, degrading, inhumane treatment. Lots of different freedoms in those categories. But we also talk about something called economic and social and cultural rights, and those are equally important. And some of you have mentioned those. That's the right to health care. That's the right to housing. That's the right to education. That's the right to work and to work in health, safety, and safe conditions, right? That's the right to engage in the freedom of religious practice. So we have these different types of rights. Now, let me ask you again. Do you think that some of these rights are more important than others? Should we prioritize them? Must we have the right to something before we have the right against something else? Are there priorities around these, and how would we think about that? Yes? The right to life. It's really hard to argue that I need housing if I'm not alive, right? So the right to life is something that's very important. How else might we think about this? What else might be important? And does anybody disagree? It's hard to disagree with that one. What else? How might we prioritize rights? Or are they only, yes? Is it more or less fundamental than any other right? Oh, you want like me? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll just keep talking while he fires me up here. Okay, so you should have. I can't help but wonder. Is that good? Okay. So the argument here is that the right to religion, to religious free practices might be more important. Okay, can you hear me now? I'll just go stand by the podium. I'm sorry, I'm causing you trouble. Might be more fundamental than the right to housing. Does anybody disagree? You said housing, right? Do you disagree? No. All right, well, you can think about it. Well, here's the reason I'm asking you this question, because it's actually really quite fundamental, because that's international law, and the norms that we've created tell us that these rights that we've created, these many different types of rights, are universal. We all get them, but they're also indivisible, which means from a moral standpoint, and in some respects a legal standpoint, we are not supposed to differentiate amongst them, right? And it becomes, and I'm surprised we don't have more controversies in this room about which housing versus religious rights, but the world is replete of controversy around which of these rights are more important to protect than others. And it's divided cultural lines, it's divided along a lot of different lines. So we know these rights are universal, we know these rights are, in theory, indivisible, but here's the big question. How do you get any of these rights to actually translate into practice? It's one thing to tell you that you have them and that we can't choose amongst them. It's another thing to actually figure out how you facilitate the incorporization of these norms. And so to do that, we've built a very large system of international institutions. That includes civil society organizations, that includes a large body of laws and procedures and mechanisms that are designed to
facilitate the creation of and diffusion of these very, very important norms. And so the first fact that I'd like to share with you of the 5 facts for tonight is that we've been really, really successful at doing this over the course of the last 60 to 70 years. At the global level, we now have, depending upon how you count, about 18 different global treaties that countries can make legally binding commitments to, and that are designed to protect these civil and political rights, these economic, social, and cultural rights, to outlaw discrimination against women, to outlaw discrimination against racial minorities, to protect people with disabilities, all manner of things, to protect children. Okay? So how about getting countries to actually sign on? We've got 18 of these things up there. If you had to take a guess, how many do you think Russia has legally made commitments to? Random guess. Wrong, 11. 11 of these 18 treaties the Russian government has ratified and made legally binding at the national level commitments. Afghanistan? 11. Mongolia, 17. Mali, 15. Brazil, 15. Guess how many the US has made? 5. Whoever said 5, you're the winner. 5. 5 it is. Okay, so what this figure shows you, and I hope you can see it, is just sort of a graphical visualization about how successful we've actually been. And this just shows you, don't worry about the acronyms. These are just the acronyms that talk about different treaties that are out there. And this shows you over time, these solid lines, the number of states in the system that could ratify these agreements. And the dotted lines show you the number of states that have. And what you see, you can maybe just look at the at least one treaty, is that basically every state in the world is making legal commitments to these types of agreements. They're all signing on, and they're legal promises that they're making. A nice way to picture it might be this, which is this shows you that the oranges and the blues have made somewhere between 5 and 18 commitments, legally binding commitments, to these different treaties today. So you can get a pretty good snapshot about what that looks like today. And these are just the global treaties. We also have a whole bunch of regional systems, 3 particularly strong ones, that have legally binding commitments. So this just shows you the African system, the American system, which is the entire continent of the Americas, and the European system. Same thing, the solid line shows you how many states are eligible to participate, and the dotted lines show you how many have legally signed on. Right? We've got great participation rates, tons of treaties, great participation rates. And of course, this shows you the International Criminal Court. So I'll just give you the updated snapshot, might be a little bit easier to see there, which is that the greens are those countries that have ratified the Rome Statute, giving jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court to prosecute criminals for certain types of human rights atrocities. And the oranges are those that are signed. And there's quite a number of countries, especially those who have been involved in war and some pretty bad behavior, that have given jurisdiction to this court. So that's fact number 1. Big success in terms of the building of these institutions and getting countries to actually participate, at least on paper, in these institutions. The green ones are the countries that have ratified the Rome Statute, and the orange ones are the ones that have signed but not yet ratified. So we have signed but not yet ratified. Oh, have neither ratified nor signed. Those are the holder outers as of this moment. Please feel free to interrupt at any time, by the way, with questions. Okay, so I want to move on to fact number 2, which is that despite these many promises, we still have to deal with the fact that human rights abuses are epidemic in this world, in every region of this world. And the statistics here are really staggering. And again, I want to show you a map. By our best metrics, freedom of the world has dropped for the 9th consecutive year in a row. And the people living here in the yellows, if you can't see the bottom here, are considered sort of partly free. This is done by an organization named Freedom House, which is a data collector in some sense. And then you have a lot of not free countries, and then a bunch of the worsts, right? And this map should be pretty horrifying because it suggests that there are a lot of problems in a lot of places in the world right now. Any ideas about why that might be the case? Why it is that we think that freedom in the world might be declining over the past decade or so? Yes?
What the metric exactly is measuring? Like, how do they determine that a country is free or partly free? Because it seems like I know at least a number of countries that are on that list as free or like not perfect by any means.
Yeah, guys, this is really chunky data. I didn't want to show you the total nuances because it would be a really complicated rainbow map. And this is the easiest one to look at. But essentially, they have a pretty detailed survey that goes through each individual country that is done by different affiliates depending on the country. So, you know, we can't go on the ground in North Korea and really do this one really well. We kind of know it's not really free, so that one's not too difficult to discern. But they go through and rank all of the civil rights, all of the political rights, the liberties, et cetera, and then they create indices, and this is just the brute collapsed form. So you're absolutely right, there's huge variation in here, but it kind of makes the brute point. There's an awful lot of purple on the map, right? And so we see a big increase in the institutions and a lot of purple on the map. So any ideas about why that is? Why we might see an increase, a decrease rather, in freedoms over time? Okay, well, we'll come back to it because there's lots we can talk about. Number one rule in social science is that if you want to change a behavior, you have to know something about why people engage in that behavior. You need a causal model in order to really think about that. And behind every perpetrator, behind every sort of not free and worst of the worst, and even partly free, there's a person. There's a family, there's an institution, there's a structure, there's something that's motivating what this behavior is. And I think there's a lot of different forces that can be participating here. We talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like to do that. But it's important for us to think very carefully about what it is that's driving people to engage in these types of behavior, because nobody wants to be the victim of human rights abuse. That's a universal. Nobody wants to be tortured, right? But yet we are engaging in all types of bad behavior. So what exactly motivates this? And here we can draw a lot of insight from fields of criminology and psychology and sociology about what motivates people to commit crimes. And the very simple point I want to make here before we move on for the sake of time is that there are exceptions, but for the most part, the thing that's driving this problem, it isn't insanity. It's not that people are mad. It's that, or they might be mad, but not mad in the sense of, right, needing to have actual psychological or psychiatric treatment. Most people engaging in these institutions play a role in a broader set of institutions where they are operating with what seem to be reasonable incentive structures given the environments in which they're living and given the choices in which they're facing. And there's a whole large battery, and I would love to tell you more about it if we had time, but we don't, of psychological and tests, decades of it as a matter of fact, that show us this following thing, which is that most perpetrators aren't crazy people. They are people that, to them, are making choices that seem reasonable, that seem rational, that they can morally oftentimes justify and rationalize in their own heads, and will readily do so, right, given the circumstances that they're in. And the big lesson that that teaches us is that responses about these behaviors, if you're going to try and change these behaviors, telling people that what they're doing is wrong, or that it's immoral, or that it's illegal, doesn't really have much impact if people have made those rationalizations already, unless they really believe where the message is coming from. They believe the message is legitimate and the messenger is legitimate, and or, in the ideal world, both. They believe that there's going to be some consequence for what they're doing. Okay, so this leads me to fact number three that I want to share with you, which is that when you add together fact one, that we've got this incredibly successful proliferation of institutions, and we've gotten all these governments on board, at least legally making these commitments, but yet we have the proliferation of so many of the problems these institutions are designed to solve. We have not done a very good job as a system of analyzing the extent to which these institutions that we've created are actually doing what it is we want them to do, and how they're doing what it is we want them to do, and how well. Okay? We've been operating with an awful lot of assumption about these institutions and not a lot of facts. And that's to no real extent fault, because it's only very recently that social science has developed better, more sophisticated tools, and they are imperfect, but they are evolving in a better direction, that can allow us to really begin to evaluate, okay, well, what's the impact of these institutions, and how would we assess that, and how would we think about where they're working and why? And so for a long time, we've operated without that. So I'm going to give you more data here, because I'm the data person, and I kind of like to look at these pictures. And this just shows you one example. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that's this little acronym down stands here for, one of the core international laws designed to promote and protect human rights. It's one of the key laws at the center of what we call the International Bill of Human Rights. And these little dotted lines here just show you every year over time the number of countries that have ratified this agreement. And what these shaded lines show you are broken up by different types of human rights violations, the violations that countries are actually engaging in. So you can see, as more and more countries have joined this institution, we've also seen the rise of political imprisonment, and we've seen the rise of violations of workers' rights, and violations of political rights, and censorship, and killings, and tortures, et cetera, et cetera. So the point here simply empirically is that these things are moving together. We, on the one hand, have more of them. We have more participation. We, on the other hand, have more violations. And we have a very substantial disjuncture. Now, does this mean that laws never work? Absolutely not. Okay, not at all the point that I want you to take home. The really important question is to ask ourselves, okay, well, where and how does commitments to these types of institutions have a positive impact on human rights behavior? And where do we see the cracks? Where are the problem areas that we might be able to address? So can you guess where? Where do you think these types of legal commitments, what types of countries or situations might we find these laws to be most effective? Any guesses? Democracies. You know the funny thing? Not really. We can't really find strong statistical associations there, and in part, I think it makes sense when you think about the fact that many democracies already have very deeply embedded domestic legal capacity that help to generate these laws. Now, it's not to say these laws play absolutely no role. They certainly do. But we can't really find a strong independent effect on these commitments really pushing democracies to do things that they would not otherwise do. But you know where we do find that effect is primarily in societies where you have relatively stable situations. You're not at war. You have relatively developed or developing civil society, but you got a really big history of problems, right? You had a previous dictator and a bunch of people who worked in his government who are still there, some of whom are still in power, some of whom are now disenfranchised, but you've got democratizing institutions that want to make commitments to change, we call this time and consistency problems, but actually have a problem making those commitments. And in those types of locations, we can actually find pretty strong correlations behind commitments to these laws and improvements for human rights. The problem is, or the downside to this is that the statistics show us that in those areas where we have the worst situations, and not just the worst situations, but not good, stable situations, we have a very hard time finding any historical relationship between participation and commitment in these laws and improvements. And in fact, we can talk about it in the Q&A if you're interested, we often find the reverse, which is what we will see countries that are signing on and participating in these agreements will actually decrease in their protections for human rights over time. So this is a nice way to visualize it if we return to our map about the free and not free, granted it's chunky data, right? There's Russia up there, super not free. How many treaties? 11, right? There's Algeria up there, 11 treaties, very much not free. So you can get a good sense of what this looks like. We've been operating on assumption and not on conversation. And what that means is we now need to start operating on a conversation about what that potentially means for our strategies of moving forward. Do we need to create more law? Will that be the solution? Do we need to reform existing law? Do we need to look outside of that system for alternative mechanisms to enforce it? All these questions should now really be on the table. Okay, the data also indicate that the system, based on these individual, universal and indivisible principles, actually has some quite interesting patterns in practice. And these patterns are quite important because if you think about what this system does, state sovereignty, right, this system is very weakly enforceable. There's nothing outside of states that can really genuinely enforce this system. And at the core of that system is information. That's how we enforce and spread and proffer these norms. And so we need to talk about where that information comes from and what we know about that information. So I'll give you some real quick examples here, and then I want to move on because I think you'll find the next part perhaps even more interesting, which is that there's a lot of bias that we can now identify using these big data in how these institutions are actually making decisions. And oftentimes they're probably very unintentional and certainly not necessarily malicious. But very simple things, like if you're a country that participates in UN peacekeeping, do you think the United Nations is likely to shame you for when you do bad things? The answer is no. If you're a country that sits on the Human Rights Council, which is the main agency in the United Nations enshrined to promote and protect human rights, do you think the United Nations is likely to shame you and provide information about you? The answer is less, much less. And that's a problem because right now, Algeria, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, the United States, they're all on the council. So there's a systematic amount of bias in terms of who's getting called out for what they're doing. And that's just something we have to be aware of. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that we need to be aware of. This is also true, by the way, for institutions like the European Court of Human Rights. So I'll move on for the sake of time. So this brings me to fact number 4, which I think is genuinely interesting, and I'd like to hear what you think, was that it's not just about political institutions. You are hardly surprised for me to say to you, oh gosh, the UN is not a neutral institution. It's not working objectively, right? Not a surprise. The important thing is that we understand what the patterns of bias are in those institutions. Okay? But this isn't just about the United Nations. This is about the broader system of the way we collect information. One of the things I always like to tell my students when I'm teaching my human rights course is that there is no such thing as objective, neutral information with regards to human rights. There are facts. There was torture, there was not torture. There are interpretations and differing interpretations about that. But there's no such thing as a truly objective source of this. There are simply many different sources of information that have different incentive structures, if you will, to produce that information. And again, why this matters is it's that information that drives the enforcement structure of these institutions. So I want to talk about 2 and hear what you think. So does anybody know of human rights NGO? Does anybody participate or give money in one? Or name some human rights NGOs. Amnesty International. Yeah, my slide's on Amnesty International, so let's go right there. Okay, so this just shows you a history over time. It's a little outdated at the moment, but it just gives you the information over time about the number of publications, background reports, and press releases that Amnesty International publishes on different countries around the world, okay? And it's only gone up over time. And what you just see here, the takeaway, is that it's a lot. They're really busy, right? These are really busy people publishing a lot of information, really important information. Now what I want you to do is look over the same period of time. This is going to show you the countries, the top 20 countries that were sourced by a particular source that we used to identify how bad violations were. And these are the bad guys, right? It kind of makes sense. North Korea, Colombia, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Somalia, Myanmar. Bad things, definitely bad things happening in these countries. Okay, here's a graph that will show you, or table that will show you for that same time period, the countries under which Amnesty is actually reporting on. Turkey, Russia, China, the US, Israel. Also, lots of problems going on in these countries, absolutely no question about it. But what I want you to see is the difference between these 2 tables. There's the one with the top 20 really bad guys, the ones with the top 10, top 20 focus groups of Amnesty International, and there's only a couple that overlap. Now, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Amnesty International is a political organization. There's absolutely nothing that says that their key job has to be to only report on the top 20 bad guys at all. But nonetheless, right, there is a pretty substantial difference in who is getting reported on. And Amnesty, when we brought this information to them, they didn't know it. So it certainly wasn't an intentional strategy, okay? But it matters for who's getting reported on, again, because that's the underlying system of enforcement. NGOs are incredibly important, and I hope we'll have time to spend more time talking about the role that they play, because they're essential and critical to this system. But there's another set of actors that are really important to this process of information, and that's the media, and what it is that the media decides to broadcast, right? What it is that we're reading in our daily newspapers. I don't know how many of you read Amnesty International reports. I do because it's my job and I work with them, but probably not everybody. The way you probably get your information is by picking up the Newsweek or the Wall Street Journal or whatever your flavor, right, of magazine is. And here, too, we are able to start identifying big historical patterns in what the media is choosing to report on with regards to human rights violations around the world. So you've probably heard of this phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. It's not actually totally accurate. So this is a picture that shows you the density of media reports by Newsweek and The Economist. They were coded for every single country over this period from the 80s and 90s, so the data are a little out of date again. I apologize for that, but it'll give you a sense, a visual sense. And it shows you who's getting outed by the media. And you should notice that there are some interesting patterns in here. Sure, not really surprising that China and Russia and the United States are up there. But there's an awful lot of Latin America up here, right? Look how big the El Salvador thing is. There are systematic patterns, and I can show you the statistics, but I thought this might be more intriguing to look at it visually, that show us that the media are systematically over-reporting and under-reporting on certain places compared to how bad the violations actually are. Again, probably not doing it intentionally. Certainly there's no one sitting behind a desk, fuming, okay, we're really gonna nail it to El Salvador, That's probably not what's been happening at all. But these are organizations that have different bottom line incentive structures from the Amnesty Internationals of the world, but that also are not out there reporting necessarily on if it bleeds, it leads. They're effectively actually not doing that. The number of large-scale wars in Africa, for example, that have caused massive bloodshed don't come close to the news coverage of what has happened in many of these other countries. Again, may or may not be a good or a bad thing, but it is shaping the information that we have about how to actually enforce this system. So this is important because it's the reason information is important might shame governments to make their own decisions, but it's really important to shape public opinion, right? It's really important what you think. It's important what you think and how much you think it so that you're calling your senators and you're giving money to the Red Cross or whatever your institution of choice is that are out there actually trying to change incentive structures for these actors who are engaging in these types of violations. So I want to say just a few things about what we know about public opinion, because here, too, we have some really interesting information coming from the big data and social science. So this one is showing you some cutting-edge polls done by a colleague of mine and a co-author. 4 different countries, Mexico, Colombia, Morocco, and India. And essentially, they want to understand whether or not people living in developing countries in the world that are oftentimes the target of human rights interventions know anything about human rights, care about human rights, are engaged with human rights organizations. And what they're finding is that the answer is tremendously not. That oftentimes human rights, the terminology is considered to be quite an elitist term in some of these locations. There's a pretty big disconnect between how the West is thinking about this and how these countries are thinking about it. And this is simply asking a question: have you participated in the activities of a human rights organization? And the answer is essentially no. So there is a gap in the developing world in terms of how people are thinking about their own relationship to human rights, and that's very important. And many of these countries, this is a much bigger survey, so this is just simply one question, actually view the term human rights with great suspicion. And that's a huge problem for the human rights movement in an effort to proliferate norms if the very organizations that are doing that are not seen as locally credible, right? That's a really big problem. Now, more generally, we know that human rights conditions absolutely shape the way that people think about the situation in the country. So if Amnesty International publishes a bunch of reports saying really bad things are happening in country X, people in that country and around the world are actually likely to take that at some face value and believe that's true. But the thing is, we also know through a lot of research that not all people have the same perceptions of the identical human rights situation. So it's not just the objective contextual factors that matter, but it's who you are also shapes how you think about the severity of the human rights situation that you're living in a national context. So any guesses about who would be more optimistic about if I were to ask you how bad is the human rights situation and I would compare it, right, to you? Who would be more optimistic about human rights? Who would be more likely to say, less of a problem, more of a problem? Number one, the wealthy. I couldn't find a US dollar sign, so I put the euro up there, but I just figured it would be, yes, the wealthy, absolutely. What else? Any other guesses? Democracies. So no, that's a great, absolutely great hypothesis, and there's no data that I can think of on that, but it's a great hypothesis. Yes? So we can't actually find a huge amount of information based on regime type. This survey was done not in North Korea, yeah, we can't get it in North Korea, but all around the world in all different types of governments. It's the wealthy, it's the educated. You and me in this room think fundamentally differently about the same human rights situations than do the less educated in our communities. Also true for age. The older we get, the more likely we are to think that human rights violations are less of a problem. And men, right? Women think systematically differently about the severity of human rights than do men. We don't have an explanation for this. We can just simply document to you empirically that who you are really shapes how it is you are going to think about the severity of the problem. Okay? So that's an awful lot to take in so far. We've learned that the system is amazing because it's on the rise. We've done an incredible job at creating lots and lots of laws and getting lots and lots of buy-in from governments around the world. But at the same time, freedom in the world is down, and certainly it's problematic to look at the big graph and have so much purple up there. There's a lot of locations in the world where we're having massive, massive complications. We've learned that these legal systems and commitments to them absolutely correspond to very important protections and improvements in human rights, but generally not in the places where they're most needed, right? It's sort of in these middling countries that are consolidating their domestic political institutions, and these normative legal structures at the global or regional level can help that process, but they're not really forcing change in democracies. They're reflecting it. And they're really not helping us much with the big, massive crises, at least in present day, or at the time that we look. So that's a lot. And now I've just told you that the information systems that are underlying all of this exhibit a whole bunch of different patterns with a whole lot of disagreement and a whole lot of biases, which, whether they're for the better or for the worse, are affecting the way we enforce and think about the enforcement of the system. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with fact 5, which is that despite all of this, I'm actually very hopeful. So I think the role of social science is very important in the study of human rights, and I think it's changed fundamentally, because it used to be very normatively driven. And it's not to say it's not normative now, and normative is good and is important, but it's become very fact-based driven as well, which is to say we want to go, we want to find all the successes we can find, and we want to understand where they work, why they work, and we want to emulate them. But we also want to go poke as many holes as we possibly can and find the cracks. And where the cracks exist, we want to understand why they're there, and then we want to try and understand, can we fix them, or do we simply need to circumvent them? And so that's the role of social science, and this is why I'm very hopeful for the future. So I would like to give you 2 examples of some of the work that I do, and I'd be happy to talk more about any of it in Q&A, and I'll be brief. That is, some of that work is focused on how we actually reform the legal system. I want to talk about other areas where we're essentially looking for new and creative ways to think about how do we push forward this movement of advocacy and promotion. So there are a lot of ways that you can do this, and one of them is you can link issue area. So we talked about the fundamental nature of the sovereignty problem, right? And that is not a problem we are going to solve. That is not a problem that is going to disappear. There are going to be no legislating and regulating that problem away. So if we have a weakly enforced human rights system, and we're continuing to build it in strength, and we're adding more and more to it, but it's never going to enforce itself. The question is, can you attach it to anything else that is more enforceable, right? And the answer is sometimes. And can that work? And the answer is sometimes, but not all of the time in certain places. And one of the ways that this has been happening is through trade agreements, for example. So fundamentally non-explicitly human rights issues, although trade is related and implicates human rights in all ways, in many ways. But the governments, many governments of the world who are in the business now of promoting human rights, for better or worse, are making attachments through their trade agreements. And I gave you a couple of examples in the US context, but Europe is actually really the leader in this in some ways. So we have a lot of different trade agreements in the United States where we attach human rights provisions. And actually Congress mandated this by law in the Trade Act of 1984 that basically said, hey, executive branch, when you are out there thinking about offering a generalized system of trade preferences, which is a way to essentially provide market access to the developing world, a non-reciprocal relationship, or now any of our sort of regularized trade agreements, you need to be taking into consideration respect for workers' rights. It's a narrow definition of human rights, but it's an important definition of human rights for the United States government. And that means that you should not be offering trade privileges to countries that are doing really bad things, and it means you should be considering threatening to or actually revoking trade privileges. What this graph simply shows you, again a bit out of date, but for the period starting back to the 60s all the way to the early 2000s, is the number of trade agreements out there in the world. The black ones are the ones that have issue linkages to human rights that say, you violate workers' rights, and I can sanction you by law. And matter of fact, I'll be required to, doesn't mean I always will, but I'll have the ability to actually do it in some measure or not. And there are a bunch of different examples where this has actually proven to be a way not to resolve, it's not a panacea, it's not a magic bullet, not to resolve all human rights problems, but to essentially force a calculus of change at the regulatory level inside countries like Mauritania, we were talking about at dinner, is one example. Oman is another example. There are many examples where we can see genuine improvement, again, at the regulatory level. Whether that perfectly translates into genuine behavior, that's a more complicated question. We see this happening. And I won't bother you with the statistics, but I'll simply tell you when we go and we run all the statistical models, we can find pretty strong evidence that there's a systematic pattern here for countries that have participated in these types of institutions to actually make improvements to human rights. And we see that happen more frequently in countries where the human rights laws themselves don't seem to be having that same impact. Is that going to work in China? No. North Korea? No. But there are a variety of locations where that's had some inroads. And so there's one area. I'll conclude on one more area that I've been working on intensely for the past, 7 or 8 years with a colleague of mine, and that's on election violence. And I think this is important because it highlights the earlier part of our discussion that we were having, that these rights are universal and indivisible, but actually sometimes we have to make choices between them, and actually sometimes there are trade-offs between them, right? So one of the fundamental human rights that we have according to law and according to our norms and this system is the right to a free and fair representation, right? We get to elect our governments. We have that fundamental right. And what's very interesting is that in the last 30 years, that right has spread like wildfire. Right? Elections are happening in almost every single country, a couple of exceptions, but almost every single country in the world at some level. Okay? The problem is that in many instances, countries are taking up the electoral process with absolutely zero intention of using that process to oust their leaders from power. Right? They're not genuine competitive elections. They're doing it because the World Bank told them to do it, because the EU told them to do it, because they want buy-in. There's lots of reasons that they're doing it, but it's the norm now. And it's a success of the human rights movement that we've spread the electoral process. So what do you do if you hold an election you don't want to lose power? What do? You kill the opposition. You can fix the ballot box. You can harm the opposition. You can get the opposition to boycott. That's a really popular strategy. A really good way to do that is to be violent towards them. Who else would you harm? That would be a great idea. Unfortunately, there's not always the best incentives to do that, right? If you're in an environment, if you look at the number of places that have elections that are in unstable environments and yet still hold elections, it's very difficult to do. So it's an interesting question about when you choose to buy off your opposition versus kill them or torture them. But we actually find, and this just shows you the history of all elections in the world from 1960 through 2010, and this is just the number of elections that are being held every year, and anything that hits a bar here is the number that's been violent. And I separate these into both pre-election and post-election violence because I actually think they're related and they're very, very important. But if you're a leader in power and you're forced essentially to hold elections and you don't want to lose, and stuffing the ballot box isn't going to solve your full problem, you harm voters, you scare them from turning out, or you force them to turn out, right? And you scare away the political opposition. So this is a massive problem in one of the many modern problems, I think, that's explaining the proliferation and the rise in human rights abuse over time. And it's one that we can tackle. And we can look at it empirically. So I'm realizing I'm out of time, so I will just conclude by saying one of the things I've been doing for the past long time with this colleague of mine at Yale is we've been building models of trying to figure out, looking at the historical data, looking at every single election that's occurred over this period of time, how do we predict when election violence is going to break out? Because that's step number one, because we work with the Carter Center and other election monitoring organizations, and you have to know where election violence is going to break out. And it's actually pretty hard to predict. You can say, well, Kenya, yes, maybe not, but it's highly variable. And then the second thing we've been doing is trying to build models to try and suss out, well, how well is this actually working? Like, leaders are using it because they think it's going to be an effective tool. But how well does it actually work? And what are the mechanisms through which it actually works? Is it actually scaring voters away? Or is it actually pulling voters in? Because you need to know that information if you're going to figure out how to intervene in those situations to change it. Is it leading to boycotts, right? And what do boycotts do? Decrease electoral competition, right? So we're building models to try and figure out how we can get the underlying structure of what's causing this stuff so we can be in the field with the organizations that are actually doing this stuff on a day-to-day basis to try and prevent it and help them figure out how to make actual assessment of whether or not what they're doing is working. And it's really hard to do that in a way where just because things move together doesn't mean that A caused B. Yeah? And so that's a fundamental challenge. So those are some of the things that we've been working on in our lab, many others, to think about ways to tackle these pretty big fundamental problems. But what I hope you take away from this talk, in addition to potentially some new information that you didn't know, is that we've made really genuinely incredible inroads into building a system to protect human rights. I just don't think there's any way to deny that, and I think that will continue. But that as the list of human rights grows, so do the problems, but also so do the opportunities to think creatively within that system, but outside that system, or in conjunction with that system, about how to actually change policies so that we don't have another decade of the world getting less and less free and less fair. So thank you very much for your time and attention. It's been my pleasure to chat with you, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. And I don't know your format in terms of moderation. Are you moderating? OK.
We now have time for questions. If you have one, please raise your hand and wait for us to come to you with a microphone. As always, priority goes to students.
Oh, don't be shy now.
Hello, thanks for coming. I wanted to bring it back to when you mentioned NGOs and ask, in your opinion, what do you think are effective NGOs and why are they effective? And also compare them to political institutions or things that are in the government that help promote human rights or stop human right violations, and just your ideas on what is effective and what people can do in those to make them more effective.
Great questions. OK. There are different types of NGOs that provide very different types of services in the area of human rights. And so it kind of depends a little bit about what the goal is in terms of how we're thinking about effectiveness. But there's no question. So the simplest one for me, a tsunami hits, people are without food, water, and clothing. There's an immediate emergency crisis. Governments are often terrible, including the United States government, terrible at organizing, right, how to interface this. And it is oftentimes up to humanitarian interventions and organizations, almost all of which are generally non-governmental, supported by governments, that come in and try and help the crisis. And that's Again, depends how you want to define effectiveness. Will they save everybody? No. Will everybody get water exactly on time? Probably not. But that is an unbelievably important, essential service that a lot of these organizations provide. But there's a division, and I don't mean a division ideologically, just in terms of services, in terms of what organizations provide. Amnesty International is not in the business of funneling water to people who are hit by tsunamis, right? They're in a very different business, which is trying to channel resources against governments to get political prisoners out of jail, et cetera, et cetera. So they would tell you that they're effective because they manage to organize resources, they manage to get bureaus in different countries. Getting bureaus in a different, I mean, they have institutions in 96 countries, something like that. Getting local institutions is really helpful precisely for this information story we've been talking about. If you don't have somebody on the ground to tell you what's going on, it's really hard to out the problem. It's really hard, therefore, to shame, and it's really hard, therefore, to kick into play the mechanisms that are supposed to help, which is you get the UN upset, and you get various governments upset, and then you get things focused. So there's a lot of ways that these organizations can be effective, but they look really different, right? So one is, right now, I help you solve, let's just go, for example, the refugee crisis, right? Or migration crisis, and we help people in those locations. And there's the other, which is the really, really long-term strategy. How effective has Amnesty International been at reducing political prisoners? Well, political imprisonment has gone up in the world. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners. But on the other hand, they have been instrumental in having many, many released. So it becomes somewhat difficult to think about effectiveness in a black and white term, right? And you kind of need to operate in the shades of gray. But I think that those are some good examples of sort of long-term effectivenesses in creating infrastructure to provide information, and these short-term examples of actually being able to intervene in crises in ways that they can provide services directly to victims who need them when governments are essentially leaving them behind. And the second part of your question was about, other domestic political institutions. So are you thinking about national human rights institutions, for example, national human rights commissions? So maybe not everybody knows what those are. They're kind of a more recent thing, and they're a really interesting political beast. So you can have these international institutions that we've been talking about. You can have these non-governmental organizations that we've been talking about. And now you have this whole other category, which are national human rights institutions, NHRIs. And there's lots of commissions around the world. About 120 countries have them. So a lot of different countries have them. And these are governmentally sponsored, sometimes constitutionally, sometimes through the legislature, human rights organizations. So they are government institutions designed to promote human rights. And they are supposed to work in tandem with civil society institutions. And as you can imagine, the paradox involved in trying to assess the effectiveness of these institutions, they on the one hand are arms of government, and government are often the perpetrators, right? And governments are not particularly interested in reining themselves in always. They are, on the other hand, the connection to civil society organizations in so many of these different locations, and have momentums of their own. And they're also accredited at the international level. So it's a terrible accreditation system, but the way it works is that some of these institutions are a lot better and a lot more effective than others. And it's highly variable, but they're highly controversial beasts. It's a little hard to talk about those in generalizable terms because we're still kind of trying to figure it out with the data, but they're highly variable. Myanmar is just going to be opening a national human rights institution. I'm going to tell you it's not going to be ranked very well, and its model is going to come from Indonesia, who's going to have a much better ranked model, but who will be replete with problems. Can you ask the arm of the government to regulate its own human rights? That's the real question, and these institutions are struggling with.
Hi, thank you for giving an awesome talk. I just had a question on the over and under reporting that you mentioned briefly. How much do you think that's affected by two factors, one of which is deviation from the mean, as in like a small human rights violation in the US is big news, whereas, oh, it's just another day in Russia. And then the other one would be like how much power the country where it's occurring has on the global scale, as in, again, I'll use Russia or China, has big human rights abuses, and additionally has a lot of influence over its region and the rest of the world, as opposed to a smaller actor in South America or Africa that doesn't really have sway over anything else.
So I think you're spot on. I'll just take them backwards in the way you've. So the powerful one is quite interesting because there's two different ways you can hypothesize what you've just said there. And one is the big, powerful countries, especially the big ones who are serial violators, aren't going to get that much attention because there's the big, powerful countries, and they're the ones producing all this media, and so they can go lay it on, right, their former colonies or whatever it is that they want to lay it in. And we actually see it in the opposite direction, which is that the big, powerful countries get a lot more attention. Bigger populations, wealthier, and that is when you control for, by which I mean when you take two countries that look as identical as we can get them to look sort of statistically, and you put them side by side, and they have both really, really, really bad human rights, the more powerful country will get shamed and will get outed more often. But I love your question about the deviation from the mean because I don't know the answer to that question statistically, but I think it's really clever because I mean, it's sort of, right, if it bleeds, it leads, but then it's also sort of fatigue, right? So we see this with regards to the war in Iraq and war of Afghanistan. It is no longer really on the front page of the newspaper every single day because we're exhausted of it after 10 years. Massive, incredible atrocities are occurring there, but it's not what's happening on the front page of the newspaper every day, and it's precisely, potentially, the deviation from the mean. So I can't answer the question with data, but I think the intuition is really smart.
Thank you so much for being here. If you wouldn't mind going back to the slide on the CCPR, this might seem like a trivial question, and if it is, feel free to answer it as such.
Okay, let me just see if I can get it.
But it looked like there was a decrease in the number of states that had ratified the CCPR, and it was my understanding that once a state has ratified a treaty, it's a very difficult process to unratify. And if that's the case, I guess the broad question is, what's the value in measuring ratifications if a regime change might make that treaty no longer apply in a country regardless of whether their name is on a list? Thanks.
You're welcome, and I'm sorry that this is, I may not hear. Unless somebody would like to assist technically, thank you. I don't have the password in order to put that back up there. But I think the answer is, and we'll have to look at it. So it's a little bit of a statistical aberration, which is that we're looking at the number of countries in the state system able to ratify, and we have the death of some countries and the birth of some countries. So actually that number doesn't stay stable over time. So the key thing that I wanted you to, focus on, and you show me when I get to the right one, because there's a couple of the different ones up here. This one? Okay. So,
it looks like there's a decreased percentage of the number of states that have ratified the CCPR.
That's because certain states have fallen out of the system, are no longer states, and then they jump back in, right? Then new states are created, in essence. So the key part to see in here is really, if you just look at the sort of trajectory of the lines, right, to see that they're essentially trending in the same way. So this is just going to be, I'll have to tell you historically, I'll have to look at the data to tell you historically what it is, but there are states in the system that die, and then new states that are created, and that is what explains the trend of this line. So this is just the way we map the evolution of statehood, essentially, in our data sets. So the key here, again, is just to see that the lines, with the exception of disappearances, and interestingly, disappearances have just been replaced by other things. So we spent a long time trying to figure out if the law is somehow helping disappearances, and it's not. It just turns out to be super duper inefficient as a way to kill somebody. And so there's other ways to send more signals in terms of disappearances. But does that answer? No, they can. There are countries that have done that, and they have done it over things like the death penalty, but it's extremely rare. And it's an interesting question to ask ourselves why. You know, I mean, I think it's interesting to ask why it is that countries participate in these institutions. And I think part of the difficulty in assessing the impact of these institutions and the success of these institutions is you have very different motivations. You have countries that genuinely want to facilitate, diffuse, and help define the norm. And in doing so, they've utilized these mechanisms, and there's genuine commitments, I'm sure levels of hypocrisy, et cetera, but commitment. There are countries that know they have deep internal political human rights problems, but want to make a commitment to reform, but they need external help. And then there are countries that are doing this completely insincerely, that have absolutely no intention whatsoever of ever abiding by these legal commitments unless it becomes in their interest to do so. And so when you think about what it means to have a single institution where you have really opposing incentive structures and preferences for why you would participate in that institution, but kind of a singular set of rules about how you operate within that institution, it becomes pretty difficult, right, to include all of those in the same body and then try and determine this question of, well, okay, so who is it helping and how is it working, right? Really, really complicated. But it's, to answer your question, it's very rare that countries are pulling out of these institutions, but it does happen.
Thank you so much again for coming. I had a question. You mentioned in one of your slides about how human rights is often viewed as an elitist term, and as a result, many people in those countries don't view it as something that they can participate in, or something that maybe is accessible. So I had a question along those lines as well. Is it not just it's a elitist term, but also that human rights is often used as something as like a veil for other interests? And like you kind of mentioned, there are often human rights institutions that maybe aren't necessarily effective, but also in many countries it's the fact that they just are kind of a veil for propaganda or other means. And I'm curious as to whether or not human rights or labeling something as like a human rights policy is actually effective, or whether or not just accepting it into like the norm of how you act in other policies, and how labeling something as a human rights policy is either detrimental or effective in like a global scale.
Great questions, and really controversial, by the way, inside the human rights community, but I think really important to talk about and to, if not resolve, at least be open and honest about, because, right, in some sense there's been this belief in the human rights community that if we just spread the word, right, if we just spread the word, then this is going to help mobilize domestic populations, and this is going to help implement and put pressure on governments and so forth. And it turns out it's not just that simple, because in some cases, the word isn't spread, but in these cases, but in other cases, there are familiarities with these terms, and they are not positive associations. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons for this, okay? So I have a lot of Chinese students who are in my class, which I just love the diversity of the backgrounds, international students who are taking my class, who say to me they grew up in the mainland Chinese context with human rights being labeled in their household as a very negative term. Now, when you ask them, of course they want their rights. They just don't talk about it in the same language that people in the United States do. The values may be the same, but the terminology that gets associated with these things is very, very important. And it's a huge question about the framing, right? Do you label something a human right because then it gives you the tools of the human rights community? Or do you just say, okay, wait a minute, at the end, let's just talk about development. Let's stop talking about human rights with China. Let's just talk about development as the vehicle toward which we're going to promote a growing middle class, to which will promote X, Y, and Z. And there's not agreement in the human rights community. And North Korea is a great example of this. North Koreans do not, the government does not want to be lectured at about human rights. But there are inroads into what can happen that will help human rights in North Korea, but it's not going to be using the human rights terminology. That much is clear, right? So it's a really big debate about, do we engage? Is this diplomacy? Is it punishment? And to what extent does the terminology actually really matter here? And how is it that the potential victims are actually thinking about, right, what these rights are, and whether they actually label themselves as victims? That's another thing that I haven't shown up here, but is in some of these surveys. But there's a lot of information that tells us that we, the international community, through the UN or the WHO or whatever it is, may label you as a victim, but when we go and survey you, you don't see it that way. And that makes intervention very, very difficult, right? And a really good example of this, and it's not a particularly pleasant one, so I apologize for that, but is female genital cutting, okay? So there's an example of a practice that is a social, cultural, oftentimes in some case religious practice embedded in a variety of different societies that the World Health Organization, that international law, that a lot of bodies tell us is a fundamental violation of children's rights, of women's rights, and is bad for health. When you talk to many women in these societies who are practicing this, that is not their interpretation of what the practice is. Now, I can't argue with you about who's right and who's wrong. I can simply tell you that I have an opinion, but I leave that aside, but that there are differences of opinion, right? And it becomes, when you attempt to deal with it in a policy sense, so Senegal is a very good example. You spent time in Senegal, right? So we went in, the European Union in particular, and essentially tried to litigate out, to the extent we could, their policies through punitive mechanisms. And do you know what the consequence was? Complete and total backlash. with the women who were performing, right, these rituals completely up in arms about how dare you come in and tell us that this is a human rights violation. But you know what has worked? In Senegal, but not in Ghana, so there's a tremendous variation, is that there have been organizations. There was a very famous NGO called Tostan, who came in to Senegal in particular, and they didn't yell at people. They took health information and just simply showed, look, I'm just going to show you what the data show us about the physical health effects related to the girls who are involved in this practice. And they educated the communities, and they got imams on board, and they got local religious leaders on board, and they got local health practitioners on board. And through the process of education, they managed to translate then all the way up into national law a changing in the practices of these cuttings, right? So it really matters to people how you label these terms and how people think about these terms. But the sort of assumption is if we just spread the word, we're going to solve the problem. It's not the right assumption. And so that's been one of the key things I think that social science is able to provide a growing amount of information into by doing all these cross-national surveys.
Hi. Thank you for your time and your speech. So in one of your slides, the last fact, you said that you were hopeful for the future of the development of human rights. And I was wondering, as a professor, what your opinion would be about how our age group, college-age students, could get involved in human rights, and whether it's on the ground or behind a desk, like what we should be doing throughout the school year in summer, what you would recommend as the beginning steps to take to get involved in this field.
Yes, okay, I love that question, and I have a very strong opinion about this. So the first thing is, don't major in human rights. No, I'm serious. Take classes in human rights, but go get degrees in economics. Go study engineering. Think about going into the private sector, right? Human rights and the study of human rights for a very long time has been, I think, really quite narrow. It's been thriving in the legal community, and that's a very good thing. But sort of the notion of the human rights degree, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm not supportive of it. I'm very supportive of educating my students on human rights, but I want students who are going to care about human rights, know about human rights, who are going to go and run companies. And that's how they're going to solve the problems. Who are going to go into government, who are going to have degrees in any of the things that you're doing. And you guys all have joint degrees, right? So I talked to a woman today who interviewed me for the journalism class, and she told me she was doing a degree in religion and politics. You can't be more involved in human rights than that, right? So this is the way to do it, is to go and educate yourself on what these issues look like, which is through taking classes, which is through donating time, if you can do it, to whatever organization you choose to support, participating in human rights organizations on campus. I think educating yourself is the best possible thing you can do. And then don't pigeonhole yourself into human rights. Make human rights a broad, general thing and not a tiny little niche that, oh, well, you just do human rights. No, we should all be doing human rights. Corporate social responsibility to foreign aid to whatever it is. That's a broad answer. We can talk more specifically if you like, but I think that's the way I educate my students to think about it.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk. Like yourself, I'm also very hopeful regarding the future of human rights. It is interesting to see like how far we have come within just few decades, like from the Nuremberg trial after Second World War II, tribunal in Sierra Leone and Rwanda. Like we actually hold individuals responsible for harming human dignity and punish them. So it's a great hope. And like in 1998, a breakthrough happened with the negotiation of Roman Statute. You showed us like there are so many countries that have not signed ICC, but under Article 13B of Roman Statute, we can hold them responsible for violating human dignity if ICC would refer the case to, if Security Council would refer the case to ICC. So there is a lot to hope. But the problem is like, the three countries which is not a part of ICC and which is a Security Council member country, Russia, China, and United States, we cannot hold those three countries responsible, the officials of those three countries responsible for harming human dignity and their close allies. And interestingly, all the perpetual offenders of human rights are either the individual from these three countries or one of the close allies. So, and it has, it has raised the questions regarding the legitimacy of some of these mechanisms that we have created for safeguarding human dignity. So I'm wondering, like, what is your opinion? Like, is the current international law, current mechanism of international law, is actually promoting global justice, or it is just a mechanism to promote injustice? Because we see that this mechanism actually is creating injustice more than justice. And where do you see the future of European Human Rights Court and ICC after 10 or 20 years? Thank you.
Such big questions and such big debates. So this is a nasty debate in the policy community, right? You probably know this, but people tend to have pretty black and white views about whether this institution is really about the promotion of justice or for precisely the reasons you've identified not. And one of the things I hope that came across in the way we've been having this discussion tonight is that these are fundamentally political institutions, and they will always be that, and we must never pretend that they will be anything other than that. That includes the courts, that includes every single component of, of the system that we've built is inherently political and based on sovereignty. So the dilemma that you've just identified is a genuine dilemma. Are Russia and China, et cetera, ever going to agree to allow these institutions to operate in areas where it might signal that it is okay to intervene in state sovereignty, which neither of them approve, not the nor does the United States, by the way, unless it's on our own terms unilaterally, right? And the answer is no. We're never going to solve that problem. But what's interesting, I think, about the ICC, and I think incredibly controversial, and I think the jury is just out, is whether or not there is an inherent trade-off sometimes, right, in producing aims at justice today or down the road I said it the wrong way, aims at justice down the road in exchange for peace today. So you see this institution making the former prosecutor pegging off really big cases, right? Heads of government in Sudan and Kenya, and then lots of war-torn rebels in Uganda and so forth. Cases that are going to be almost impossible to win. But where I can promise you, the president of Sudan is never going to allow himself to step down, be arrested, and be put in the Hague and tried through the ICC. And that putting arrest warrants out on him, no question, exacerbated the conflict. Is it the right thing to do from the perspective of justice? Yes. Is it going to help the situation with regard to peace? Not in the short term. So there are these inherent trade-offs, and this is happening in North Korea as well, about what this institution can do in the short term versus the long term, and whether or not justice is really the thing that we should be aiming for, or whether first you need to establish peace and then you get justice. And the issuing of arrest warrants can retard that process. And we know that to be a fact. Now, which is the right answer? There's no objective correct answer, right, to that problem. So it comes down to a matter of debate and a matter of duking out. But I think it's really complicated. One area where I am hopeful, though, is that there is a new prosecutor at the ICC. And the former prosecutor, Italian man, heavily criticized because it wasn't random where he was selecting cases, but they were all in Africa, and they were all big war-torn African situations. And there are atrocities happening all over the world. There are literally thousands of potential cases they could choose from. And it became very controversial because it just became one of these that undermined the credibility of, oh, okay, well, you're just the institution that goes after African rebels when the dictators want to throw them under the bus, you know, and in a couple of cases, the leaders themselves. Everyone's kind of waiting to see what's going to happen with the new prosecutor, but she's making different decisions, and she's opening it up to look at cases that look different, and cases where we may actually see some traction in this court. If you go after sitting heads of state, going after the sitting head of state of Syria through the ICC, disastrous decisions, right? He's just going to fight harder. Going after areas where you have former war-torn situations, where governments are willing to throw rebels or former governments under the bus, not a bad idea, because those people did really bad things. And there's people who are willing to arrest them. Right? And that's another problem. It's not just China and Russia that are the problem. The ICC doesn't have a police force. So in order I can put an arrest warrant on you, but to arrest you, someone's got to arrest you. And when they did this in Africa on Sudan, the entire African Union refused to observe the issuance of the court. And no one has ever to this day arrested. And he flies across borders. He's not going to the south of France anymore, but he's certainly traveling around Africa. So it's not just the Chinas and Russias of the world that are the problem, right? It's back to our fundamental notion of state sovereignty. It's the states that are violating these rights. States don't want intervention on the sovereignty level. They're doing it for a variety of reasons because they get something out of it. And asking them to regulate themselves is inherently the paradox of this process and why it is so difficult, right, to make progress. So I think the word is out on the ICC, but I have hope that it will evolve.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions tonight. Please join me in thanking Professor Hafner-Burton.
Thank you very much.